Hello and welcome to my garden in October. The cat is photobombing the shot again. This is the later flowering form of Amaryllis that I have. I've got two forms of Amaryllis belladonna, and this one flowers about a month later than the other one. Although I have this out in the front garden as well, and it's a bit earlier, probably a week or more earlier out there than it is out here. So it's flowering through September and October. It's starting to go over now. The earlier one out the front is now starting to produce leaves, and this will fairly shortly after it's finished flowering. And they do need full sun on the bulbs, so the hedychium that's at the back of here comes into growth pretty late. So the Amaryllis is in leaf through the winter and then dies down. The hedychium comes up, largely disguises the space, and then that dies down again, so they sort of fit in quite nicely with each other. This plant here, Liriope muscari, is performing better now than it has ever done by a very large margin, and it owes that to the fact that earlier in the year I was coming out in the evenings looking for slugs on mainly things like dahlias, finding one or two on this, but then as the season went on I started spotting vine weevils, and there were 2 or 3 every night on this plant, and I was picking them off and squashing them, and what a difference it's made. A bit of a case of who'd have thought it, but it's nice to have flowers on it for the first time. I've probably had it for 10 or 15 years, and this is the first year it's ever really flowered more than one or two spikes. This is Salvia amistad, far too well known really to need saying anything much about it. It was introduced quite a long time ago, but it's got breeders' rights on it, so you can't propagate it for sale without paying royalties, which is not a problem for us. We just propagate it for our own purposes and overwinter young plants, get them out in the garden. It starts into flower quite early in the season and just keeps going, and you get months and months and months of flower from it. Really exceptional plant. There's fairly recently been a new one introduced called Amistad Pink, which I'd heard about and hadn't seen, but popped into a garden centre a week or so ago and found a plant of it there and grabbed it. And if it's anywhere near as good as Amistad itself, I can't wait to have it flowering. But this is just such a sumptuous royal purple colour. This one is Salvia Black and Bloom. There is actually a black and blue, and who thought it was a good idea to name one Black and Bloom? I have no idea, but they do both exist. They're both forms of Salvia garanitica, a South American species, both very, very floriferous. Just behind him there, just in mentioning passing, the hedychium, which was flowering last month, over now, but the foliage on it will stay in good condition for another 2-3 months, right to the end of the year, long after the salvias have died down, and is architectural in its quality, so worth having. It's the season of things falling apart and growing over the paths. This is Salvia corrugata, and that's a fairly recent introduction. 1988, introduced 6 seeds. All the plants in cultivation came from 6 seeds that came from South America back then, and we've been growing it for quite a long time. It flowers very, very late. You really need to get young plants going quite early on in the autumn so that you get a youngish plant in the spring to plant out, which is of a decent size, in order to get them flowering before the year has ended and the frost has come and it's not going to flower. It's also pretty tender, so it won't survive. Some of the others, some of the Garanitica ones will survive outdoors. This one won't, but such a gorgeous colour. This is Salvia uliginosa, which is known as the bog salvia, so it really wants quite moist conditions. Hence I planted it near the base of this wall at the back here in the hope that moisture would come out from underneath the wall. So that's a really pretty blue colour. And the one in front of it with the very big leaves, prodigious grower, grows from cuttings taken about this time of year and then planted out as plants a few inches high, will grow 6 feet or more in the season, and then produces these long spikes of tiny little orangey red flowers with deeper red calyxes. It has rather malodorous leaves. Malodorous is one of my favourite words. This plant here was a plant that I admired in somebody's garden down the road for several years, and I knew it was Coria, but I didn't know which one it was, so I wasn't able to buy one. And eventually I went and knocked her door and said, any chance I could have a couple of cuttings? And as with gardeners generally, she was very happy for me to do so. And I took the cuttings, rooted them, and eventually planted out this plant. And it's Coria Marion's Marvel. I've since managed to identify it. An Australian shrub. I've seen it growing in the wild in Australia. And it's beginning to flower now, and it will go on flowering for most of the winter. Give very good value. Borderline hardy, but probably, as the climate warms, getting less and less borderline. When I were a lad, there were New England asters and there were New Belgian asters. And as I recall, the Novi Belgi types were rather prone to mildew, and the Novi Anglii types were not. This is a variety called Purple Dome, and strangely, there's an Aster Novii Belgii Purple Dome and a Novi Anglii Purple Dome as well, which is highly confusing. And I don't, in all honesty, know which one this is. It never gets mildew, so I'm assuming it's the Novi Anglii version. Of course, they've now changed the name from Aster to Cynthia Trichum, which is definitely not an improvement. But a rose by any other name, and whatever Shakespeare had to say about it, it's still an absolutely sumptuous plant, gorgeous colour. And a beautiful thing. A month or so ago I did make the main summer pruning on this tree and left the shoots about 3 inches long because pruning in August they're a little bit likely to grow again, start into growth again. And then I do a second prune sometime in September, which I've now done to shorten those shoots back to about 1 inch. I'm picking up quite a lot of windfalls off this my family apple tree at the moment, but most of them are Elstar, which was the original tree, and it's not a particularly good apple. They're just so ornamental, and it makes me realise just what good value apple trees are. They're both ornamental in fruit and they're very ornamental in flower in the spring, and then you get the crop as well, so they've got such a lot going for them. You wonder why everybody doesn't have an apple tree in their garden. And with having multiple varieties on it, pollination ceases to be an issue, even though I've only got one tree. This area here, I dug out a big clump of Astrantia, which was not really very good. And not wanting to leave the ground bare, I covered it over with this nice layer of compost, except that it isn't compost. It's just shredded material from my allotment. And I years ago bought a shredder because I was getting an awful lot of woody prunings from plants in the garden and on the allotment, and was putting them through the shredder and putting it onto the compost heap. And somewhere along the line I had what I think of as a light bulb moment, and thought, why am I putting this on the compost heap? Why don't I just spread it straight on the ground? It looks much the same. There's none of the nutrients being lost that they would be sitting on the compost heap for 6 or 9 months. The heat that everybody gets excited about generating on their allotment, on their compost heap, is the fuel that the soil organisms need, and they're losing that. It's doing no good. All that worm activity, I want that going on in the ground, in the soil, not on the compost heap. So ever since then, I cleared out my compost heaps, spread all the compost that was in them, and I've never had a compost since. So for about 3 or 4 years now, I've not had a compost heap, and I just simply shred stuff. Sometimes running it 2 or 3 times through the shredder if it's very coarse material, I just spread it on the ground. The biggest volumes of it are in the autumn, which is great because it means that I can put it on the ground to protect the soil surface over the winter, as well as feeding the soil. And I tend, if I'm just spreading stuff on the allotment, I tend to leave it fairly coarse for that purpose. But in the garden, I chop it up fairly fine. And what I tend to do also is to put the stuff from the garden onto the allotment and the stuff from the allotment onto the garden. That way I don't spread any diseases I don't sort of keep diseased plants on the allotment to spread to next year's crop, and likewise in the garden. This is my trusty shredder. I use it a lot, so it was worthwhile getting quite a good one. I'll just feed material in the top. Comes out the bottom, and this is what I get. So that's sweet corn that I had on the allotment. It's gone through that, and I've put that through probably 2 or 3 times, and it's nice and fine. It's actually, I've just put it in a bag here and it's warmed up a little bit, but I mean, it's pale, but it's not foul smelling, and it is certainly not unsightly. Spread on the garden, which is where it will go. There are quite an increasing number of hardy begonias around these days, but the one that's been around, I think probably the only one that's been around for a very long time, regarded as hardy, is Begonia grandis. And this white one here was given to me by a gardening friend. And I also have, just behind it there, a pink flowered form of the same thing. And I've just not really given much thought to, I just, Begonia grandis white, Begonia grandis pink. But because they are completely reliable and good performers, I've been looking around for other begonias, been seeing other forms of Begonia grandis on offer, and have now picked up 4 different sorts. So I'm pretty much in trial mode and seeing what they're like, in the hope that they'll all be as good, as well behaved and as good performers as this one is. This is Begonia grandis Sapporo. This one is Begonia grandis subspecies sinensis. It's a Blythyn Wyn Jones collection from Krieg. and collected in China. On his website now he's just got it as Begonia sinensis, so he's regarding sinensis as a separate species from grandis, but it's obviously very closely related. Smaller leaf, nice strong pink coloured flowers, red underside to the leaf. If you can find somewhere in the garden where the sun is shining through the leaves and you're looking at it from that side with the sun behind it, they are absolutely beautiful. This one, which is Heron's Pirouette, is a Dan Hinckley introduction, again the sort of name that guarantees that you'll get a good plant. And this actually has green undersides to the leaves, and to some extent is not really terribly special, which almost sounds like a travesty talking about Dan Hinckley. There you go. The other thing I should mention about these is that they have the buds in the leaf axils turn into little bulbils. They drop off and they turn into little bulbils which drop to the ground and grow again as new plants in the following year. So they are a propagator's dream. Well, that's the end of another programme. October, we're well into autumn now. But at the moment I'm quite pleased with how it's looking. There's a lot of stuff still flowering, which is as per the plan, as it should be. So thanks for coming. See you next time.